Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sumi. Pleasure to be here and to see all of you live in person. I know that this event has, as with many others, been aching to reconvene in ever larger numbers, and you've done it. I want to give a very special congratulations to Burkhard and your team at Visit Berlin and the whole constellation of organizations that are working together to drive the revival of Berlin and the movement to define its future. And I have to say, as someone who's just flown in, but is studying cities and the post-COVID recovery around the world, there's just very few places that everyone who's in this domain is looking at and saying, which are the places that are kind of setting the standard? Who is building the kind of place that people want to be? And that people can, in fact, come to, arrive in, find a place, whether you are, tragically, Ukrainian refugee or a digital nomad, or maybe a climate migrant. What cities are ready for the world ahead and that are innovating? And guess what? Berlin is on that list. And many of you may be Berliner, which would be a wonderful thing. Those of you who are not, but if you, like me, have been coming here for more than 30 years, I just want to remind you, it was not a foregone conclusion 30 years ago that Berlin would be what it is today, that it would be the place that if you took a vote of hundreds of millions of young people, of talented people, of professionals all over the world and said, hey, what's the coolest city in the world? Berlin would probably be number one, right? That's not something that was obvious 30 years ago. So it's the great work of many of you in this room and most certainly of the Visit Berlin team and of the Senat, the mayor's office, and everyone else. So let's step back a bit, because every city, a city this important, a city this visible, has a role to play in the global division of labor, in the uncertain future that lies ahead, a world full of challenges. And I don't want to sugarcoat it, so to speak, because there are many people who look at very specific challenges that are afflicting the world. It could be, obviously, COVID. That was shattering for so many societies. Could be civil war, conflicts, geopolitics, social unrest, political polarization, supply chain disruptions. Now, ordinarily, you would say, well, that's one crisis this week and another crisis next week and another crisis next week. But what's been happening in the last couple of years is fairly unprecedented, right? It's everything at the same time. And I'm not here to tell you that it's going to get any easier. It's not. The kind of world we live in, if you want to put a very academic term on it, is a complex system. It doesn't ever return to the way it was, the good old days, whatever decade you may define those good old days as being. That's not the way it works with climate change. It's not the way it works even with politics. Things keep on moving in chaotic new directions, and these forces, these challenges, collide with each other, right? COVID and geopolitics simultaneously, in border closures, which has an impact on food prices, and that leads to political instability in many parts of the world, and on and on and on and on it goes, which leads to refugee flows, obviously. All those things are connected. They're not just separate news items. So the hardest thing to do intellectually is to try and have the foresight to say, well, what comes next as all of these forces collide? Or, since you actually cannot do that, even with all the supercomputing in the world, we can't quite figure out exactly what's going to happen next. Can we prepare for anything, prepare for everything? And that ultimately is a challenge that cities have to do, not just federal governments. We can't just wait. This is no longer a world where city leaders wait for federal governments to tell them what to do, to give them the off-the-shelf solution. The solution comes from the cities that are responding to those challenges, and then those lessons spread from cities to other cities. So, just to summarize where we are in terms of this global complexity, right? It's a world where we've never had such wide demographic imbalances. That means the gap between old and young. That's right here in this country, it's all across the Western world, and it's globally, where the Northern Hemisphere is aging, the Southern Hemisphere is young. We have the political crises. Right now, there are a half dozen or more locations in the world that are the origin of more than 1 million outbound refugees or asylum seekers. Think of Myanmar, Afghanistan, Syria, of course, Yemen, Ukraine, Venezuela, at the same time. These are not even connected crises as such. So the politics and geopolitics, the spillover effects that has. You have your economic dislocation, financial crises, even just the accelerating process of the late 20th century of globalization, leading to factories closing in one place, people losing their jobs and moving to new places. You have the technological disruptions of labor automation through artificial intelligence. Again, more people lose their jobs, move to other places. And then there could be positive technological disruptions, like remote work, of course, right? You can be a digital nomad, you can take advantage of that and go move and live anywhere. And then you have climate change too. And what do all these have in common? Well, these are the 5 or 6 buckets of drivers of human mobility. This is why people move from point A to point B. You could go back to the retreat of the last ice age, which was about 12,000 years ago, for those who don't remember what they learned in geology class, and you would look at why did people move? Or the last 100,000 years, as our species began moving across the continents, there's always an environmental reason, a political reason, resource-related reason for why people move. And today, all of these forces are in hyperdrive, right? We talked about the number of conflicts, we talked about the gap between old and young, and climate change. And the difference between this world and, say, 12,000 years ago is, of course, connectivity, right? We have this physical, infrastructural connectivity. So you've got a very simple mathematical kind of formula here showing that we're going to have accelerated mobility. We're going to have more people moving in more directions than ever before. And this may seem very ironic because we're just coming out of a lockdown, right? And the lockdown may prove to be, the most temporary big thing ever. And a lot of people extrapolated from that movement. In 2020 and even into 2021, people said, well, this is it, right? It's a whole new world. People just can't travel, can't move. Well, tell that to, Heathrow Airport, right? And the piles of baggage there, and tell that to refugees coming out of war zones, and then the growing number of climate migrants. You can't stop the force of human mobility. So prepare for a century where it becomes more and more and more. And the struggle that we have at its most fundamental level is actually a geographical one. And it's because the geographies, and I say geographies plural, that characterize our world are very fundamentally misaligned. We just take for granted that the map of the environment, of our natural geography is stable, but it's of course not stable, right? Because of rising sea levels, because of desertification, because of destruction of the rainforest and so forth. And the political geography is being challenged all the time. Look at the wars that have blown up and that frequently do even when we don't expect it. The map of political boundaries is also not stable. The map of economic geography and infrastructure is certainly not stable. Relentless competition between countries and cities for business, for economic activity, that too is highly competitive. And the last map, the one on the right, is the map of human geography. That's us. Right? We are the result of those forces. Right now, again, it seems stable. During COVID, we like to tell ourselves, well, this was it. This is the finished map. This is the 8 billion people in the world, and this is where we live, and this is where we are meant to be, and this is where we're going to be. And I'm here to tell you that's not at all true. When you have all of those driving forces pushing people to move, when you have all of this misalignment of these layers of geography, that map, these pixels, here you have it. There are literally 8 billion pixels on this map. And the United Nations announced on Population Day just a couple of months ago that they're marking November 15th, so exactly 2 months from now is the day when they will declare that the world population has 8 billion people. So I jumped the gun, I put 8 billion pixels on this map. And this is where we are now. This is going to change. Now let's zoom in on one very obvious and major significant reason why, and it's climate change. So what did I just show you in the last 5 seconds? This is called the Suitability Index. Right? The Suitability Index looks at the change in the capacity, if you will, of a place to support human life based upon these relative pre-existing conditions. Now, a place that's red, it doesn't mean that you cannot physically live there, but it certainly becomes less and less comfortable. And a lot of people have looked at the Ipcc global climate projections, and we've told ourselves, because they've told us, well, by 2040, emissions will rise to such and such level, and temperatures could rise this much, and the map will look like this. But if you saw the news just a couple of months ago with the heat waves in South Asia, for example, it already looks like this. This is not the map of 2050 necessarily, right? Again, complex systems are always evolving and changing. I hope that by now we all understand that we do not have till 2050 and then in 2050 we start to pay attention, right? I don't think I have to tell anyone here this. So those numbers, you have to always throw away the calendar in a way and look at the trend that's already emerging. And this is where we seem to be headed. And clearly this means that people will be on the move because there's some bitter ironies in this map. Again, I showed you before the human distribution, and now you have the climate model. Now, you must have noticed a couple of things. Most of the population of our species lives in places that are turning more and more red. And if you looked at it by age, you find that most of the older populations in the world live in areas that are green or greening, and most of the young people in the world, literally the demographic future of us, is more or less trapped in these conditions. And if that isn't misalignment of geography, I don't know what is. If that is not a significant ethical, moral, and political challenge, the central one of our time, I don't know what is. This is it. Now, I mentioned that for thousands of years, people have been migrating and moving. If you just take the last few centuries, you will notice, you can literally count it, that several hundred years ago, if you go back to colonialism and the slave trade, you had millions of people moving over the course of a century, tens of millions. By the late 20th century, we had hundreds of millions of people relocating around the world. And primarily, not only did populations grow, especially in Asia, but you had mass migrations from Europe to North America, and you've had from the Near Eastern regions into Western Europe and so forth. But you notice that over the last several centuries, the drivers of migration have largely been categorized as either political or economic, right? War or the search for opportunity. But now you have already in this century, in just the last 20 years, a third of all migration is related to climate. And we don't even have laws that properly govern and account for that. But be that as it may, people will be moving, they'll be searching for a better life. And I think we are creatures fairly predictable, if you will. You know, if we were all governed by a program, the program would probably say, fight or flight, right? Seek stability, seek places that have food and water, right? That have healthcare, education, where you can have a job, that are friendly. Fairly obvious kinds of things. And that circulation of people is inevitably going to push people in that direction. And that means, of course, places that are green on the map and that are politically stable on the map and that are building in the right way and that are evolving politically in the right direction. Places like Berlin, perhaps. And who's going to be doing the moving? Well, it's going to be above all young people, because what's happening at this point in time is that the world population is also plateauing. Fertility has actually been declining for decades. And so, as I mentioned, the UN is going to say we're reaching 8 billion people now. The world population at its peak, which will occur in the next 20 years probably, is not going to reach more than 10 billion people, which is still plenty, but it's not a problem of the number, it's about the distribution, right? We have plenty of space on this planet for 10 billion people. There are 150 million square kilometers of land for anyone who, pop quiz, right? But where people live is the difference, and it's going to be about young people. And who are young people? Well, a lot of you are young people. And if you were to take, and in our political conversations, especially in mature economies and aging societies like Germany or America, we sort of take for granted that we always talk about aging, the world is aging, the world population is aging, look at Japan, even look at parts of China and so forth. But actually, I want to remind everyone, there are more young people than old people in the world. Just a fact, right? There's if you take the millennial generation, Generation Z, and Generation Alpha, right? The three generations that constitute the world's youth. That's close to 5 billion people. That's the majority of the human population are young. If you were to line up 8 billion people in the world, or soon 9 billion people, and take the median human being right in the middle, that person wouldn't be like a post-war, late 20th century family, married couple, 2 income, suburban household, 2 children. That's not the structure anymore. I think a lot of you might be able to relate to this. The median person in the world is young, not old. The median person doesn't own property. The median person has very precarious employment. The median person lives in a very large, developing world megacity, not in a wealthy society. The median person doesn't have children, right? This is you, many of you. It's most of the world. And it's certainly 100% of the future. Even as people get older, family structures are changing, demographics is changing, sociology, values are changing. And what do young people value? Well, young people are the most surveyed and psychoanalyzed generation in the history of the world because tech companies read all of your Facebook posts and all of your Instagram feeds. And what they say is that young people actually have values that I hope all of us identify with, right? Connectivity is a human right. Sustainability is a human right. Mobility is a human right. And I think we should be redesigning our institutions, our infrastructure, our political systems, our business models around these values that I think young people intuitively share, and they have a lot to teach the world about how to design our systems. So I put youth at the center of my work, and when thinking about the future of human geography, building a better world and finding the ideal locations to optimize the talents and potential of youth should be every single person's #1 priority. And that means rather than thinking about a world that's governed by xenophobia and populism and walls and borders, we should be thinking a lot more about recirculating people based upon their skills or humanitarian reasons and reconstituting society accordingly. And I think we can do this. Just a reminder, in the big grand scheme of things. If we look back at the last couple of 100 years, well, we can give ourselves a scorecard. We're really bad at maintaining global peace. Really bad. We're really, really bad at taking care of the planet, aren't we? Can I tell you one thing that we're unbelievably good at? It's absorbing the movement of people. Despite all the borders in the world, 200 countries, more countries than have ever existed, more borders, more checkpoints than ever before, and yet hundreds of millions of people, 1 billion people this century will inevitably move. And we are very, very good at it. So don't let any politician or leader say, oh, hold on, this is just a cultural, conundrum, how will we ever do this? This is exactly what Western societies in particular have done so well for 200, 300 years, is absorb the movement of people. And the winners are those that do the best, that absorb the most people and do the best job of integrating them and creating an ever-evolving culture and civilization out of them. So, Angela Merkel famously said, "Wir schaffen's," and I would say that's what needs to be thought of on a global scale. So my final message is also a call to action, which is that you want to be part of the solution, right? Everyone does. And I would say that the solutions fit into 2 buckets, 2 simple things that can be articulated in layman's terms. If you're doing one of these 2 things, you're part of the solution. You are either moving people to where the resources are, right? You are helping people move to stable locations, politically or ecologically, or you're moving technologies to people, to where they need them if they can't move themselves. And that could be solar energy, it could be water desalination, it could be drought-resistant seeds, whatever the case may be. Ask yourself every day, are you either helping move people to resources or technologies to people? And if you do that, if you're part of that, then you're on the right side of history, and you are officially what it means, I think, to be a Berliner in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Parag. I'll just ask very quickly, because we're short on time. I'll ask you very quickly, do you think Berlin is in the position to take on this hyperdrive mobility that you described? Is Berlin the right place for this?
It's one of them. I had a map I didn't show, which I call new civilizational centers, and we have to remember that the history of humanity is also the history of people moving to cities, right? More than half the world's population is now urban, and it isn't one city. We have many, many, many cities. And when people talk about the fate of the city, they often have in their mind sort of like New York or Los Angeles. But again, the last 7,000 years is a competition among cities, actually, to be the hub, the imperial center or the civilizational center or the radiant cultural center. And there will be many, and there will be newer places. And Berlin's population, as you know, is just recovered to what it was 100 years ago, right? So there is space. It's so funny seeing friends here who are running some of the new locations in Berlin that are meant to, redesign the city and the experience. And we have space, and it isn't just here. It's all across Europe and all across the northern hemisphere and parts of the southern hemisphere. The point is that Berlin, it's not about the number of people necessarily, right? It's about doing the right things and setting that example so that other places follow suit. And that's where I think Berlin is going to play a great role.
Great. Thank you, Parag. I wish we had more time for more questions, but if you can, grab Parag in the coffee breaks, and I'll try to do the same to ask some of the questions I have. Thanks for the great presentation.